My name is John Cutler, and in this video, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, cascades. I've written a bunch about cascades and pyramids and the limits of those particular models, but I wanted to make a quick video about it. So here we have a pretty common cascade, a pyramid. We've got pillars at the top, priorities, initiatives, epics, tasks. You can see that there's a time scale over here. So there's a time scale right there. Sprints 1 to 3 months, 1 to 3 quarters, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years. And then people who are responsible, I guess, for the different items or own these particular items with product teams at the bottom and the CPO and leadership team at the top. Obviously, these things serve some need because you see them everywhere. But let's look more deeply about what's going on and what these things tend to miss. So the first most obvious problem with these is that it very much appears as if information only flows one way. It flows from the top, and that if you're neat and tidy and if you organize things correctly, everything will ladder up beautifully. But ultimately it flows from the top. Okay, that seems to make sense. Some things do flow from the top, but it in no way indicates that a lot of the information that the CPO is going to need to be able to frame the pillars is about what's happening at the bottom. So on many companies, this is where the customers are because teams are shipping things to customers, right? And so a lot of the feedback about what's working or not working or the direction things can take often comes from the front lines up. So that's one particular problem. Now, the next thing here in this specific pyramid is there's no real explicit sense of outcomes. I mean, I guess you maybe could imply that maybe the priorities have OKRs connected to them, but there's no specific mention of outcomes in this particular pyramid. So that's kind of another issue. But in addition to that, you also don't really have a sense of the time for outcomes to materialize. So for example, there's things that you could ship, tasks that you could ship that could create some kind of outcome in 1 week. And there's initiatives you could deliver that might take 3 to 5 years to materialize. They're long haul type initiatives. So there's no real sense of the lag of particular outcomes coming off of this type of thing. The next problem with these things is that it almost by definition is pushing more prescriptive things the further you get down the particular pyramid. So as you go down the pyramid, what are you going to put there? You're going to put tasks. You're going to put epics. You're going to put work. And so if you're trying to inspire your product teams to be more strategic and think more in terms of outcomes, but you're putting them at the bottom of this particular pyramid, well, that means that basically the product team's responsibility is to deliver epics. Now, you could argue, I guess, that they're supposed to know how these epics ladder up into everything that they're doing, but it basically relegates frontline teams to much more delivery-focused stuff. You don't see problems here. You don't see high-level problems that the VPs are maybe figuring out. You see priorities, and then, ultimately, things get more prescriptive as you get down the particular pyramid as you're going. So there's a lot of issues with this related to impact, related to time, related to causality, related to, here's another problem with these. For example, sometimes you have 1 to 3 year initiatives, just big hulking efforts. What is an M&A move, for example? That might be a big initiative. Sometimes you have big initiatives. Sometimes you have initiatives that take 1 to 3 weeks. Does that mean that a 1 to 3 week thing is not an initiative? Is it just an epic? Like, what if I could produce outcomes, like initiative level outcomes in 1 to 3 weeks? Wouldn't you want to do that? Are you going to force every team to create an epic and an initiative and maybe even a priority or whatever for every little thing that they do? In some sense, this disincentivizes teams from working small and producing outcomes. Like, you could have a 1 to 3 quarter initiative that involves shipping every single day. Is it still an initiative? Or is that 180 initiatives, assuming that it was, whatever, you get the idea that it was 6 months. So there's a lot of issues with these particular value pyramids. They're good for explaining a basic concept, but they just break down on multiple levels. So let's talk about this more, and I'll give you some details around why this happens. So one way to think about this, back to that temporal scope aspect, is I want you to imagine 2 organizations, so org A and org B, and the types of goals that they would be setting. So you can see for org A, increase engagement with a new feature. 1 to 3 months is improved conversion rate on mobility by 10%. 1 to 3 quarters, maybe that ties into double onboarding completion rate across different regions. And maybe in 1 to 3 years, they're expecting some 50% plus market share in core market segments, analyst coverage, et cetera. And in 3 to 10 years, that's going to transform how mid-sized businesses manage inventory globally. Sounds pretty decent. So this is temporal scope is along this axis. Now, Org B has goals, but their goals are ship the mobile sign-up bug fix. In 1 to 3 months, they want to deliver the Q2 initiatives. 1 to 3 quarters, it's launch onboarding redesign across all the regions. Then 1 to 3 years, establish our product as the market leader. That can mean anything, right? And 3 to 10 years, it's actually kind of the same at 3 to 10 years. So the point here is that temporal scope and the culture of the company work together to give you what the kind of resolution of these things are over periods of time. You don't get this from a particular pyramid, right? But the reality is that these organizations can be different. Now, one thing I would note too is note how here in this example, the product teams are owning up to the 1 to 3 quarter range of goals. And then you might have a director of product, you might have a VP of product, and you might have the CEO that sits there. Compared to the team below, let's just make this a little less messy. The product team focuses on ship the mobile sign-up thing. You've got a delivery manager who's making sure they deliver the Q2 initiatives. You've got a director of engineering or product who broadly wants them to launch the onboarding redesign. That's how they're going to be measured. And you have a GM to establish the product as the market leader in mid-size retail. All to say that the culture in a particular company has a huge influence how some kind of pyramid like that could be interpreted. And in two companies, goals can be much more work-centric, and another company, goals can be much more outcome-centric. You wouldn't know from looking at a pyramid. But let's take this one step further, and let me explain again why these pyramids just don't tell the story we want them to tell. Let's imagine for a second that in addition to outcomes, we have multiple different lenses. So I won't go into all of these in depth, but I just want to give you the sense of what's happening. So there's the outcome lens, which we've just discussed. We mentioned that in this particular version up here. But that's one view. Now, someone is going to actually care about the work. So there is a work view. Now, it happens to be that in Org A, they put outcomes as a sort of higher order discussion than work, but someone's going to ask about work. Your marketing team is going to ask about work. Someone's going to wonder what people are doing. So work is a valid frame in this picture. Now, there's another frame, which is the finance view. So maybe finance does weekly OpEx snapshots, and then on a monthly basis, FP&A looks at the monthly financial reports just as a cost center review. In the 1 to 3 quarter range, they're doing quarterly forecasts. They're maybe trying to do initiative ROI tracking on up to long range planning, strategic budgeting, all that kind of stuff, that good stuff that happens in the longer range. So yet another frame. I just added one other example frame here. But whenever I've done this exercise, there's maybe another 3-4 frames that you need to think about. I did structure. So how quickly is the structure changing in the organization? In the short-term range, maybe it's temporary role adjustments. In the quarter range, you're doing team reshuffles. In the maybe that was the month range, but in the quarter range, you're doing new team spin-ups, 1 to 3 quarter range. Then you have the strategic reorgs, the operating model redesign, M&A, and different levels of responsibility or ownership of these things. So what I want you to take away from this is that we started with this very simple pyramid. And then I discussed how in two orgs, just take goals that they could be pretty different in terms of ownership and how you define those things. And then I jumped into the different lenses that you need. And I noted how there's multiple lenses that we might use to view what's going on. So here, for example, the work lens gets relegated down here, I guess, or maybe down here. And I was noting down here that work could range up to 1 to 3 years. Work outcomes could range from 1 to 3 years. Finance could range from 1 to 3 years. And so that's nuance is incredibly, incredibly important. So this brings me to my central thesis here. If you think about this cascade like this, the reason why I don't prefer cascades like this is it's much more like a fabric, like this thing on the left, which is you've got a set of lenses. And you have things that are moving information up the temporal scope, down the temporal scope. You have things like corporate strategy that starts long-term that influences many things down to the left. You have things that are generally connected in the middle, like risk view, the finance view, the work view, the goal view. It's not a cascade. There's no way that this is a particular cascade. It's much more like a fabric or a graph where there is a temporal sense, many different lenses and many things, different things connected together. And that means that this is what your goal should be. I work for a company called .work. That's our logo, .work. We think a lot about this. This is why we're designing our product the way we are, because a lot of products in the market believe that this is the view of the world. They structure their UX behind it. They structure everything behind it. And the reality is it's just not the view of the world. You're never going to get what you need out of a system like that. Let me just dig into two more concepts before we close. The first idea is this idea of anchor artifacts. And this relates to what we're talking about above. So, when you have something like a long-range plan or an annual plan or a quarterly plan, there is the horizon of the artifact, and then there's basically the refresh rate of that particular artifact. So the LRP is refreshed and tweaked. So the large refreshes happen once a year. The tweaks happen on a half-year basis. And that's the horizon and the refresh rate for these particular things. Again, going back to the pyramid strategy, especially right now with AI, it could be changing every month. You still might be putting together your strategy or whatever, but the refresh rate is speeding up a lot in the current environment. And so instead of thinking about these things as, literally cascading all the time, you might think about them as things that have a horizon and a refresh rate. And so a roadmap, for example, might have a 12-month horizon with the next 6 weeks being much more solid. You might refresh that every single month or every 2 weeks or more continuously, and that would be more effective for you. So this is one way to think about it. Extending this idea of anchor artifacts back to what I was talking about is that in our analysis, you basically have 3 types of artifacts. You have these anchor artifacts, which are refreshed on a set rate. They have a particular horizon that's explicit. You have intent artifacts, which are your OKRs, your strategic pillars, your goals, your bets, or whatever. As they move through a workflow, you tend to update them. And these can be variable horizons based on the time to impact, causality, relationships, etc. And then you have context artifacts, which are things that change when the context changes. So they could change very, very fast, like insights about customers, or they could be really, really stable, like a competitive analysis. And so when you put these ideas together back to the pyramid, I just use the broad word lenses here. But what you're kind of doing here is you're talking about artifacts, right? So maybe at your company, you call the 1 to 3 quarter things big rocks, or you call the 1 to 3 weeks little rocks, or the work big projects or little project. All that stuff is kind of helpful. But what's much more important is that you're linking together these particular ideas. And then you're also explicit about what kind of artifact that is, and you're reinforcing it with the rituals you have. So for example, here, rituals guide and advance your intent. Sometimes intent artifacts nest and become like a tree. Other times they look kind of different. They're informed by your context. Your rituals are used to generate and review your anchor artifacts over and over again. And then your anchor artifacts often, like a 12-month roadmap, which would be an anchor artifact, might include things like near-term deliverables and then goals and other intent artifacts as you're working together. So let me summarize this particular topic. I started out by talking about how the pyramid is a convenient but ultimately ineffective tool for designing the guts of your operating system. It's helpful to communicate to executives and get people to nod that something exists, but it's ultimately not very effective for thinking about your rituals, your cadences, the autonomy of teams, other things. Here I gave an example of that, about how it could vary across 2 orgs, both from an ownership perspective and a definitional perspective. Then I described to you that really there's way more than just one scope, which is kind of how that pyramid does. There's different views across different temporal scopes around your outcomes, your work, your financial structure, your finance, your structure of your organization. We can include other lenses there, like a risk view of the world or a dependency view of the world, or there's other views of the world here. Then I discussed here that really you don't work in a cascade, you work in a kind of fabric like this, and it's about connecting those particular items as it makes sense, instead of just imagining that everything is basically a cascade. Then I discussed anchor artifacts as an interesting use case here, where different artifacts have a horizon and then have a refresh cadence that you refresh with your rituals. And then finally, I went through anchor artifacts, intent artifacts, and context artifacts to kind of further explain why, getting your rituals right and then discussing the various, I call them artifacts or, objects or whatever across these different lenses is probably the way to make progress with this particular problem. So hopefully this was interesting. Thank you so much.